Welcome to the Big Rethink, brought to you by New Cities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. Today is September 30th, 2020. More than 200,000 Americans have died from COVID and nearly 1 million people worldwide. My guest today is Melvin L. Mitchell, CEO of the architecture firm BryantMitchell and author of African American Architects, Embracing Culture and Building Urban Communities. He recently published an op-ed in Archinect calling for a Black affordable housing industry in America, as well as 1 million new affordable units by the end of the decade. We'll have him on in just a bit to talk about his vision for the future of American housing. But before we get started, as a tradition that I hope to continue throughout this series, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from unceded indigenous lands. The Kaniki Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in which I join this gathering today. I encourage all of you listening and watching to go to native-land.ca to learn more about the territory you are tuning in from. I think as urbanists, and particularly as a Canadian institution, we here at New Cities believe that you should know more about the land in which you come from or are coming from here in this virtual world. But with that, let us get started here on current events for the week. Cue up my slides, zoom myself down, and I'm only going to take a few moments to talk a bit about a rather disheartening performance all around at the presidential debates last night. President Trump and Vice President Biden gave Americans a lot to be depressed about, but it was especially depressing, I think, for progressive urbanists. We had the spectacle, of course, of Vice President Biden, when asked point blank if he supported a Green New Deal, said no, also talked about how he was a child from the suburbs. And, of course, most alarming and disheartening of all was the President of the United States signaling his unwavering support for police when asked about race and social justice in the United States, and openly acknowledging the white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, telling them to stand down and stand ready. He did not say to stand ready for what. But of course, going through this, the postmodern spectacle of watching our candidates come by, these images are courtesy of Glitch Television here, sort of showing how that's decaying there. But also wanted to tie this into, of course, the other more recent events is Breonna Taylor, of course, the young woman who was killed in her bed or in her home by Louisville police. The Louisville police were released by grand jury results, and basically no one was charged with her death. Officers shot her multiple times. I believe it was 6 bullets by at least one officer, if I recall correctly. And none of the officers were charged, although one officer was charged, however, with damaging the property around her for basically recklessly discharging his weapon. So as people pointed out on Twitter, no one is responsible for Breonna Taylor's death. But an officer is being charged with damaging the property around her. And of course, the indignity of this is tied to the fact that her lawyers in July alleged that basically she was killed as part of a gentrification operation by the so-called place-based investigations unit of the Louisville PD. This has particular bearing on our guest today and what we'll talk a bit about in just a moment here, because of course, the Attorney General in justifying this sort of pointed out that it was a tragedy here, but it ties into this notion of basically Black housing in America and tying it to gentrification and race. And we've talked a lot about it in New Cities this year, in our Wellbeing Cities forum that we just conducted, in our New Housing Solutions Live event in July, in the Big Rethink this spring, talking about, of course, how the pandemic has fallen hardest on African American communities in the United States and also Indigenous peoples in Canada, with higher than usual fatality rates when it comes to COVID, which is, of course, tied to the environmental segregation and, of course, tied to neighborhoods with higher levels of asthma and other sort of respiratory diseases that make them more likely to die of COVID. And so all of this is of a piece here, tying together justice, environment, housing here is a great segue for my next guest, Mel Mitchell here, who's going to talk a bit about his visions of what really sort of a Black controlled housing industry in the United States in particular would look like. And so with that, Mel, I'm going to turn off my slides. And if you want to come back out and turn your Zoom on. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mel. We really appreciate having you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I guess as a first question, if you could talk a bit about your vision for 1 million affordable housing units and particularly the policies. In your op-ed, you really pointed out that a number of US politicians, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Green New Deal, and others have started laying out the planks about how we can really start to imagine what a new housing industry in the United States would look like, including, for example, the repeal of the Faircloth Amendment, which would allow the construction of public housing again. We talked about that this summer. But what in your essay, you talk particularly about the notion of extremely low participation rates by in terms of demographics by African Americans in architecture, engineering, all of these industries, and raise the question of how do we get them more engaged in that, and how do we create really a Black housing sector, a Black, I don't know, real estate sector, architecture sector in the United States. So could you talk a bit about, I guess, your vision as a starting point?
Yeah, little context here. First of all, we've got to keep in mind here that when we talk about Black America, we're talking about an entity of, probably 45, going on 50 million people. That's a pretty big splice. However, it's dispersed over the country, but it is in all sorts of identifiable clusters and city locations across the country. So housing is obviously a central area and a central issue. Black America occupies a lot of housing, but it does that pretty much from a consumerist point of view, as opposed to more participation in it, and more involvement in it. It all ties back into this whole larger issue of Black wealth creation, or I should say, Black wealth suppression that has been the norm for so many years. And so part of transitioning from Black wealth suppression to Black wealth creation, you got to start where we are, where Black America is, and that is the housing that it lives in and it occupies. Now, right now, uh, there's such a thing as already a Black housing industry, or a Black construction industry, so to speak. And it's composed of what I call the two percenters club, uh, starting with architects. You know how that's always over 2%. Well, there's a whole bunch of two percenters that are in the built environment. Architects are just sort of the marquee, the more visible one, but you name them and I point them all out. Architects, real estate people, contractors, developers, lawyers, even to a certain extent. And so we're all already there, already operating independently in disjointed sort of ways, and all bumping up against a sort of a ceiling that nobody seems to be able to break through in terms of this 2%. We're all 2% of our whatever the whatever our professional organization is, or trade, or whatever it is, we're 2% of it. And trying to pierce that and break through that as independently doesn't work. So the issue here, tied back into housing and the need for a Black controlled housing industry, again, we're just simply replicating or returning to something that was talked about and thought about as late back as 1948, the first Housing Act, in which there was this understanding that by Black leadership that we needed to have a piece of the action. If there's going to be Black housing built for Black people, it should be also have some Black participation in it. But then there was another strain amongst Black America, worrying about segregation and being labeled with segregationists and separatists and all of that. So you have all those things bumping up against each other. So today I'm simply advocating that the Two Percenters Club formalize ourselves and recognize that this is inherently and foremost a political operation. Uh, to operationalize what I'm talking about is fundamentally politics. Uh, we've got a lot of Black politicians, and they're very strategically located, and we've got a lot of what I consider to be good allies, non-Black allies, and all of them have a lot to say about the issue of housing and which way it's going to go. Now, depending upon what happens in November, between November 3rd and January 21st, but regardless of what happens, sometime around January, we've got to start talking to our politicians and holding them accountable and telling them what we want and asking for the levers, the reins of things that give us better access to capital, to the money, the funds that are there, that are flowing through. The housing, the federal government funds, as well as a lot of the state and local funds, uh, that's just leverage money that basically ties into the whole larger private sector.
Yeah,
But
where would you start? What would be sort of your tools of this? I mean, in your essay, you sort of criticize the low income housing tax credit, which of course developers have used, and I think as you pointed out there, in that case, a lot of white developers use that to earn trillions of dollars from basically from
yes,
government tax subsidies there. Well, I would bring up, I'm curious, what do you think are the pieces of legislation or where you would start in building this now? Because Vice President Biden, for example, wants to make, I mean, his big housing plank is making Section 8, vouchers an entitlement for everyone, which does not address the structural issues you're dealing with there. So I'm also curious your thoughts on things like opportunity zones, which was proposed, bipartisan with Senator Cory Booker, among others, which was designed to basically create, to funnel investment into, neighborhoods of color and low-income neighborhoods, which has become a sort of, real estate grab, through all sorts of rewriting of things. So yeah, what do you think are the tools to operationalize this vision?
I think the tools could be with some tweaking and adjustment, and under a more liberal regime uh, uh, could be helpful. I use the word liberal because in terms of progressive, I think everything is ultimately going there. It's just a question of how you get there, and I'm not personally interested in blowing getting rid of the current administration, in hopes of immediately getting the full-blown, all-out progressive one. But I just don't think is going to happen for another generation. But a step along the way, I think a lot of the legislation that's already happened, as well as that's being planned, uh, used to be pipe dreams. Used to be just left-wing pipe dreams. Now these things are realities, and if we get a break and things go the way they should, November 3rd and January 22nd, those things will be real. And so I think all of the legislation, all of the pieces are there. Even opportunity zones, as flawed as that is, because you got to remember, all of the legislation is basically set up and designed in such a way that it's like a big plate that's passed around, good old boys, and uh, Black America and the two percenters are who are supposed to represent Black America and its interests, then they're by and large left out for all sorts of reasons and rationale. So uh, those are some of the things that I'm looking at. Now, when you talk about the tax credit thing, yeah, there's already a housing tax credit program and regime, and it builds millions of houses. It has built millions of houses, and it will continue to do so. But what Black people have not done yet, and I want to see them do, and that is elbow to the front of the line, because these programs are being built in Black space, and they're being occupied by Black and brown people, and and control of them in a manner and way as to channel and make sure that the dollars that are flowing from construction dollars, all the other pieces, control of those things can go a long ways uh, towards helping to get people, get the economies, the sub economies, the Black economy, if you will, humming and working within the framework of what we have and what we will have for another couple of generations, and that is a private free market sector.
Mhm. Interesting. there's a number of of housing models that have come out, particularly out of Black America. I mean, I'm very interested in, of course, community land trusts, which came really out of the civil rights movement in 1968, if I understand that history correctly. But that doesn't create wealth, of course. That is a way of effectively sidelining land value forever. But in your essay, you talk about a tactic that I was less familiar with, which is the buy the block strategy, really of sort of, of developing entire strongholds of Black wealth in communities there. And can you talk a bit about the history of that and how that might be resurrected as a tactic to rebuild Black communities and neighborhoods?
Well, here again, you gotta remember, context here. Since the '60s, there have been three big ideas that have been percolating and coming out of and working its way through Black America. One of them, of course, has been new cities themselves, actually building new cities. Uh, Another one is a variation of that, in which you're building new towns in town. And now the third, which is really a big idea, by the block, that's been happening for the last almost decade, but it's starting to take off. It's starting to gain momentum, and so all sorts of, in its most basic form, it's just simply a case of the stereotypical rundown ghetto type Black community in which people come together and try and figure out a way how to start buying and purchasing house by house the block. But that has begun to expand to the point now where it doesn't just involve poor people, it involves all stratas of Black America and the wealth that is happening, that is being generated in Black America. The nouveau rich money, whether it's athletes or entertainers or whatnot. So everything that is happening now in terms of trying to do things that are going to help with trying to get money circulating and working, because in the final analysis, in the bottom line is simply this: we all use this metric of the disparity in Black America in terms of white wealth versus Black wealth, whether it's home ownership or businesses or what have you. And however you measure those things, and however we're going to try and raise those things, it cannot be done if Black America itself does not participate in a big way financially as the builders and makers.
Mm-hmm.
We can't do it based on strictly being consumers, because typically take any typical housing project, let's say $10 million. Well, that's $10 million that it may create 100 units, and those may house Black and brown people, but 9,900,000 of that immediately flows right back out of that community and into the larger white community, and everybody gets paid, everybody gets wealthy, and Black people wind up being parts of photo ops.
Yeah. So you mentioned you wanted to take the 2% and formalize them. How have you thought about how to do that? I mean, are there any institutions or any new associations or structures, or how would you go about building like a block, a coalition of of Black wealth and Black
here
talent?
Again, and I want to be careful how I say this respectfully, Greg, but one of the biggest problems that I have with a lot of people, Trumpers mainly, but a lot of other people, is there's so little history or understanding of how that 44 million people that constitutes Black America, how we're made up. There's a lot of organization and structure and things going on that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are hidden in plain sight. Some of them, so there isn't a whole lot needed to be done. It's just really a matter of will and communications. It's a matter of taking things that are already there and in place and ramping up the levels of communications and interactions, but you do it around big things, big ideas, big projects in which your objective is very clear, and that is that all of the 2%ers are going to be the ones to benefit, and that is also going to be pushed out beyond and into other aspects of Black America and its community. So specifically, all of these 2%ers, starting with architects, for instance, they're already organized. They already have organizations. It's just a matter of understanding the need for political organization and structure and working with our politicians, white and Black, and being able to articulate and to say what we want. Because here's where I am. I'm basically of the mindset that America is a group of competing interests. And it's obvious how those groups break themselves out. And one of them that has about 14-15% of the pie is Black America. Mm-hmm. And there are certain things that even when we get to Valhalla of what Bernie wants, a Swedish style economy, it's still, like Sweden, going to still have a market sector. It's just that it'll have a much bigger welfare state or bigger regulatory apparatus and make sure that the playing field is level, but that still does not take away the need for Black America to function and operate in ways and manners in which we build a serious economy. It's there already in a mini form. It just has to be,
I want to stop you there with a question. We had at our housing conference this summer, our final session had almost on some level unfortunate debate, or a very interesting, tense debate between Daryl Carter, who is a CEO of is a Black CEO of an affordable housing company and finances affordable housing across the country. And he was pitted against multiple advocates basically of decommodifying housing. The notion that, that we should basically not use housing as a vehicle for the building of wealth, which is really much part of your plan to basically concentrate wealth in Black communities and keep it there. What do you think of the decommodification of housing argument and the idea that America should invest much more heavily in public housing and social housing?
I'm for all of that. Mm-hmm. It's just that I am a realist in terms of how long is it going to take that to happen? Mm-hmm. That's a 30-year project. Now, what's supposed to happen in the meantime? Mm-hmm. The country is structured as it is and what it is. I don't think there's going to be, and at least I hope not, a Jacobian type revolution where heads will be rolling. It's going to be evolutionary. And so I'm for all of the big progressive ideas, all of them, including the decommodification of housing. But that's a long-term project. In the meantime, there has to be a potent, effective Black economy that really is able to participate in and take advantage of the system in terms of how it works. Again, getting back to the tax credit thing. The tax credit thing was set up in such a manner and way that it wound up being almost 99% white people controlling it and Blacks getting the crumbs, as well as units. But terms of the money, the crumbs. Okay, well, it's going to take a while, basically, but black people have got to elbow into that structure, into that stream. So en route to all of the big, wonderful, progressive ideas, what do we do? What are we supposed to do now?
Yeah.
That's that's where I am. I'm basically a Harold Cruz advocate. You know Harold Cruz?
I do not know Harold Cruz. I feel put on the spot. No, who is Harold Cruz?
Separate but plural.
Mm.
His book, a 1996 a 1996 book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He basically was just talking about the continuity and the back and forth in Black America ever since the end of slavery. It's been back and forth between integration versus
Self-reliance.
yeah, right. Which is a kind of a ridiculous dichotomy because you gotta do both things. Why is that an either or situation? So I just think that and I'm seeing signs really of Black leadership starting to wake up and step up. Let me just say one last thing. I don't know how long we're going to be able to go here, but
I've got one more question for you after this, but please,
all
by
right,
all
let me
means.
just say one last thing, one quick thing. Um, when Barack Obama was elected twice, in both cases, I never had any expectations of him other than that he not embarrass us, that he just, I mean, I was very clear. He was elected as president of America. Had he have attempted to do anything to directly help Black America, he would have been impeached. It's clear and plain and simple as that. Now, fast forward to the day and what might happen November 2nd, Joe Biden, a liberal. Well, if Biden doesn't do something to explicitly and specifically address to the whole wealth gap and focused on Black America, he could get impeached if he doesn't do something. So that's that's where we are. That's where we've come now. And so
Well, that's a good setup for the last question here, because obviously this whole series is sort of thinking, of course, the post-COVID ramifications for cities in various degrees. We've talked a bit about what could happen past election day. I mean, the president has very, very obviously signaled his contempt for cities, his intent, what he's done to
he's got a
dismantle the Fair
housing
Housing
program.
Act.
He's got got a housing program. It may not be it's not the one that pure progressive want to have, but
Yes,
it's a
HUD is
housing
still in
program.
effect. Yes, we forget that sometimes with Secretary Carson. But the question I wanted to ask is what do you think? How does the pandemic intersect with your plan in this regard? And thinking of this, and I'm thinking through particularly that for the last 2 decades, the triumph of the city, that whole back to the city movement was, of course, based on displacement, was based on logics of gentrification. I'm originally from outside Chicago, and that was sort of you could see 250,000 African American residents displaced, I think, between 2000 and 2010. The last census that was taken. So what happens now with the pandemic, where we're seeing these narratives of mostly wealthy whites bailing out on cities, buying homes in the Hamptons or buying country homes, planning on remote work forever? We know the data shows that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to remote work. Are we setting ourselves up for a potential, or are you afraid of another potential dark era of disinvestment in cities, regardless of whether Biden is president or not? I mean, still the tax revenues, what it does to a downward spiral on city budgets and things.
There's always that possibility, but I'm a strong believer in the power of science and technology and the whole information revolution and where we are as a society and as a people. I mean, I think the United States and a lot of the West is, you know, we're at a point right now where there's no fundamental reason for there to be any want by anybody for anything, you know, none. Technologically speaking, financially, et cetera, and so on. You know, there's a whole bunch of cultural reasons why that doesn't happen. And insofar as what we're going through now, this thing that we're going through now, yeah, it's going to cause some major changes and some major rethinking of a lot of things, spatially, and how, you know, how we develop, how we do things. But I have a faith and belief that, you know, our intellectual infrastructure, you know, the universities, our technology, I think all of that coupled with a thrust towards towards an ultimately progressive state, I think that will work itself out. You know, it's these are interlocking things that have to be approached in that way. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with, you know, probably my age. I'm 3 times the age of the average progressive. On the one hand, I like to say that I'm really to the left of my children, but they wouldn't buy it. Revolution now. You know, okay, fine.
Well, I would say, I think we need, on that note, I think we need more, you know, realist revolutionaries or revolutionary realists, whichever of the two you relate to.
Yes, yes. I'm count me in the latter.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mel. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Well, for those of you watching, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with the next episode. We're going to have the tech ethnographer Trisha Wang, who's going to talk about hyperlocal communities and mutual aid. She was in Wuhan, or doing research in Wuhan when the pandemic struck, and she's going to talk about what she witnessed there of communities coming together to help themselves. So we look forward to seeing you at the next episode. Thanks again,
Okay.
Mel.